Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be presenting at this conference, albeit remotely. My name is Joshua Weber. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cape Town, and affiliated with SANBI, and a senior field officer at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And today I'll be sharing some of my PhD work, which is looking at an amphibian on Table Mountain as part of a broader project investigating freshwater ecosystem health on a mountain. I'm by no means working alone. It's a multi-stakeholder project, and this is the core group of colleagues and supervisors that continue to assist me. So thanks very much to them. So I mentioned the project is taking place on Table Mountain, which is in the Western Cape of South Africa. And it's a really unique system in that it's isolated from the rest of the Cape Fold Belt and has been for a very long time. And this isolation has led to the emergence of many unique species, obviously hundreds of plants endemic to the mountain, also a few really special vertebrates, and a few endemic amphibians. And one of those amphibians is the Table Mountain coast frog, which is restricted to a few perennial streams on Table Mountain. It doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. The adult and tadpole phase are very much adapted to these forested gorges, and the tadpole specifically is a very slow developer. It takes over a year to develop into an adult frog. So it's therefore obviously very reliant on the perennial nature of these streams, and is also thought to be really reliant on the niche habitat that these streams provide. Unfortunately, it's listed as critically endangered. It has been for over 20 years, and that's because there are a number of threats that are impacting the stream. However, there's very little quantitative data linking aspects of the species ecology or life history to these threats. So there's been very little applied conservation action to address them. And very simply, this project aims to fill that research gap. We aim to understand the ecology of the species a bit better, specifically tadpoles, to then link this understanding of ecology to the threats, and to feed that information into management decisions and rehabilitation action. To briefly mention the methods, we are using occupancy modeling framework. Occupancy is just the proportion of sites that are occupied by a species. So on the right, we have this grid, which is a theoretical study area. Each cell is a site. The orange cells represent occupied sites. And if we knew which sites were occupied, then the occupancy would just be the proportion of occupied sites, right? And that would be quite simple. But unfortunately, in a real case situation, we don't know which sites are occupied because detection probability is imperfect. And sites that we might search and find a species in don't necessarily represent unoccupied sites. We may have just overlooked the species. And occupancy modeling really helps deal with this by visiting the sites multiple times through this repeat sampling protocol. And as we visit the sites again and again, we develop a detection history for that site. And that helps create as unbiased estimates of occupancy as possible, and that reflect the true state of occupancy as accurately as possible. And ultimately, we're interested in covariates. What covariates might be driving these patterns, firstly in detection. So what may influence varying detection between each visit? Is it the time of day that you search? Is it the observer that's searching? And then also covariates that impact these changes in occupancy that we see through space and time. And that's really what we're trying to work out. And occupancy modeling provides us with estimates of the detection component and also probabilities of occupancy. And if you extend that to a number of years, it provides also parameters and estimates of extinction and colonization. It's obviously great for looking at trends in occupancy over time. So our site, we had 105 sites spread across 9 perennial streams, Table Mountain. We conducted surveys over 3 seasons, and within each season, we had 2 to 3 repeat visits for each site. And our site was at an individual pool level. This is just an example of a stream with non-detection sites in yellow. So their detection histories will obviously be 0, 0, 0 for those 3 repeat visits. You can see their detection sites have differing detection histories because we don't always detect a species, even though it's there, especially for small secretive species occurring in low abundances like coast frog tadpoles. And we then build up this detection database, which is binary, and we then model this against a whole host of covariates to try and understand which environmental covariates are driving this occupancy pattern that we are observing. And our covariates range from really broad scale covariates like aspect, geomorphic zone, an index of habitat integrity that was based on previous work, right down to really pool level covariates like water quality parameters, substrate composition, depth, etc. And the idea is really to develop a priori hypotheses based on biological questions that we might have about the system and the species, to then fit models that reflect those hypotheses, and to then run the models and rank them using AIC values. What we found is there really was a model that helped to explain a lot more variation in the data than other models, and this model really had a heavy substrate component, which we'll discuss in a moment. But to first mention the detection component of the model. So in our study, detection probability was really high. So if a pool contained a ghost rock tadpole, the probability of you finding that tadpole was really high. And there was some evidence that detection probability was influenced by siltation, so the degree of silt in the pool. As silt increased, detection probability decreased, which seems an obvious result. Silt is hard to see through. But I will say we had very few occurrences of tadpoles in highly silted pools, so this might be slightly skewed. To then move on to the occupancy component. So were there any covariates that really supported in explaining some of the variation in occupancy that we've seen? I'm just going to focus on the first year occupancy. I'm not going to chat about colonization or extinction parameters. And there really were some substrate covariates that played a huge role in explaining occupancy variation in tadpoles. The first one was siltation, which is the degree of silt in a pool. You can see as siltation increases, occupancy probability decreased. And similarly for embeddedness, the same pattern emerged. Embeddedness is the degree to which cobbles and boulders are buried by sand. So on the left there, you can see a highly embedded pool with lots of sand. There are lots of rocks, but there's also a lot of sand, and there's no space between the rocks. On the right there, that's a highly embeddedness-free pool with no substrate and a lot of gaps under the rocks. If we think, what could cause these increases in embeddedness and siltation, and it's really quite simple. Increase in sediment, generally through erosion. Path overuse leads to erosion and introduction of sand into the stream. And invasive vegetation really increases the siltation. It blocks the stream channel and also introduces a lot of leaf organic matter into the stream that causes siltation. Both of these impacts are really exacerbated by a change in the natural flow of the streams, and there are several streams whose hydrological cycle has been impacted by dams and weirs, and that decreases the ability of the stream to flush out sediments. So if we now try and link this to the tadpoles themselves, why would these things impact the tadpoles? We really think it's down to their unique morphology. They have these huge sucker mouths that they use to graze. So they graze the surface area of rocks, And they also use that sucker mouth to navigate that subcoal habitat and as a refuge in the day. And during periods of high flow, they retreat under the rocks and suck onto the rocks to prevent themselves getting washed downstream. And if that subcoal habitat disappears, the surface area available to graze decreases, and also they don't have a refuge to hide during the day, during periods of high flow. They really are absent from those areas. So to try and link this to some kind of conservation value, I think ghost frog tadpoles can be really useful proxies for ecosystem health. They definitely appear to be impacted by the main threats that are evident in the system, particularly on Table Mountain, which is an open access national park, and the main threats are overuse and erosion. And I think also monitoring their occupancy dynamics can be useful indicators of change or impacts to the system as a result of their sensitivity. And I'm not a particular fan of ambassador species concept necessarily, but I do think that linking habitat declines to individual species does have conservation value, and it can inform the public and help the public engage with impacts, and similarly help management communicate their conservation actions to the public. And again, context specific. Table Mountain, which is open access and heavily used, that communication really has a lot of value. And I think tracking conservation actions and ecosystem response through monitoring occupancy dynamics of the species also has a lot of conservation value. So yeah, that's briefly one aspect of my PhD is about. Thank you for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.